From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
As China's President Xi Jinping prepares to accept another 5-year term, is the U.S. ready for what increasingly looks like another Cold War? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my esteemed colleagues, columnist Joe Sternberg in London and editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell. Welcome to you both. The National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party convenes this week with the expectation that President Xi Jinping will get an unprecedented third 5-year term as General Secretary of the ruling Communist Party. And Joe, it seems like with this move, China is really setting its course on the direction that President Xi has taken it. And you've been watching China for some years now. There was always this hope that China would moderate, that it would become more integrated into the global trading system. What has happened that has ended that dream of a China that is becoming a friendlier country to deal with in the world?
Well, Kyle, the main thing that's happened is Xi Jinping. To remind listeners of some of the history here, it was really after the Mao era that China embarked on the first round of economic reform under Deng Xiaoping. And then once you sort of got into the 1990s and especially the early 2000s when China joined the World Trade Organization, there was a lot of optimism about both China's economic path and its diplomatic path, or the path of its relationship with the rest of the world, because certainly they had been pursuing domestic economic reforms, but there also seemed to be an element of political reform within the party. Certainly no democratization for the general public, but they had shifted away from the Mao model of leadership for life. They put themselves on track where you had a series of Chinese presidents who stuck to 2 5-year terms and then were out. That came to an end, really, now we see in retrospect, when Xi Jinping took power 10 years ago. And his view has been that the economic project, the reforms opening to the outside world, had gone too far, and that was starting to endanger the Communist Party's control of the economy. And so you've seen this twin track plan where on the economic front, there's this accelerating consolidation of the economy under state control. Certainly less emphasis on private investment and foreign investment than there used to be, more emphasis on consolidating economic power in the hand of state-owned enterprises that are easier for the party to control. And that has also come with this tightening of political control, which we now see with the fact that Xi Jinping is on track for the kind of third term that the party had not allowed for quite a long time. And yet now he is at a point where he can make that kind of demand for more power and have the party acquiesce to it.
But Western analysts seem to still be debating whether China continues to be a rising power and how long that trend will continue, or whether, as the phrase goes, China will grow old, demographically old, before it grows rich in the way that the U.S. and much of the West is. If that's correct, that suggests that there is a certain timeline they are working on to exert some of this newfound power that they've been developing. And notable that on Monday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that China had sped up its plans to reunify with Taiwan, in the phrase that Xi Jinping would use. And here's Blinken. He said, "There has been a change in the approach from Beijing toward Taiwan in recent years." He said it includes, quote, "a fundamental decision that the status quo was no longer acceptable and that Beijing was determined to pursue reunification on a much faster timeline," unquote. And part of what's notable about that, Kate, is that President Biden has also been outspoken on this issue and said a few times in interviews, in speeches, that the U.S. is prepared to defend Taiwan if it comes to that. And that has been cleaned up a little bit by White House aides after that, saying that this wasn't a change in U.S. policy. But when the president of the United States keeps repeating that, it is hard to credit that as not a change in U.S. policy, it seems to me.
Right, Kyle. So I think there is a pretty strong case that the U.S. is entering a particular era of vulnerability if she were to decide to try to take Taiwan by force. To your point, she is 69. The country is facing an economic slowdown and an aging population, a real demographic problem that starts to be a tidal wave in the 2030s. So these factors sort of suggest that perhaps she would think the best opportunity to take Taiwan might be in the next 5 years. another reason to think that it might be in the next 5 years is that the US military is also facing basically needing to overhaul its military equipment and will be kind of short conventional hard power during this window of 2024 to 2030 while we wait for some exquisite new technologies to come online. So we do have this dip in numbers of ships as our cruisers are pushing 35 years old and need to be retired. The Air Force is contracting significantly as it retires planes faster than it replaces them. So looking at the whole picture, you kind of look at well, China might see that it has an opportunity here before it starts to face internal problems and before the US has time to kind of pivot and invest in its own defense. So I think that is really the case for the window of vulnerability being rather soon, perhaps in 2024. Blinken didn't elaborate on exactly what he meant, but it's consistent with what we've been seeing the Chinese military do exercises in the Taiwan Straits. And so the question that I have is why we aren't using this opportunity to really wake up to what's going on and to start to creatively increase our hard power as quickly as possible.
Joe, what's your view of this diplomatic issue? Because the Chinese foreign ministry is describing even these relatively mild comments from Secretary of State Blinken, at least relatively mild to my ear, just acknowledging the reality. The Chinese foreign ministry is describing them, this is from the Washington Post story, as an example of the United States reneging on its commitment to the one China policy, which acknowledges Beijing's position that there is only one China. And Joe, what's your view of this issue? I mean, should the Biden administration be as outspoken as it has been in just acknowledging the reality of Taiwan's status as a self-governing entity and the U.S. interest in defending that?
So I think probably in that kind of question, the least important thing is how should one respond to the Chinese diplomatic uproar over this issue? Because the reality is that it was always thus. They have always very fiercely pushed back against any kind of rhetorical signal from anyone anywhere in the world that was at all friendly toward Taiwan, or any statement from anyone at all sympathetic to Taiwan's status as a self-governing island. So I think that the fact that Beijing would not look kindly on these remarks is not at all surprising. And I think that it's also not necessarily something that should cow the administration. I mean, I think the bigger problem is that it seems to be awfully difficult at the moment to figure out exactly what the administration's policy is on Taiwan, because you have had this phenomenon over the past couple of years, really, of Biden saying one thing and then officials kind of walking it back, and no one's entirely sure who is speaking with what kind of authority there or what the policy would actually be. Partly this is because Washington's approach had always been to encourage a form of strategic ambiguity where we thought that it was safer to not be entirely clear about what we might do in various scenarios that might be involved in a Chinese attempt to invade Taiwan. And there was a view that that ambiguity was useful, that it was helpful to keep Beijing guessing. And for a long period, perhaps that was useful, but I think that we might need to think about whether we're coming into a period where ambiguity from Washington is not going to be helpful. And eventually the Biden administration might need to figure out exactly what their policy is and then articulate that.
Kate, on the question of the American military readiness, there's a new report out from the Heritage Foundation looking at this question. I know you've dived into the report. So give us a sense of what it says about how the U.S. stacks up vis-a-vis these adversaries or potential adversaries like China.
Well, Kyle, it's a lot of what I was describing earlier, which is just we are entering a period of really managed decline that is acute, that may coincide with when China decides it's most advantageous to take Taiwan. So I think the issues are really most acute in the Air Force and Navy, and it makes the most sense to talk about them because they will be most crucial in the Pacific conflict, which is an away game. We have to pack up and get there if there's a conflict. So in the Air Force, it's just a bad story about aircraft being retired faster than they're replaced. And so the fleet is shrinking in size, is about 40% of the fighter fleet, the bomber fleet, about 40% of what we had in the Cold War. And, listener might hear that and think, well, that's okay because our new planes are more capable. For instance, the F-35, it's a great stealth plane with great sensor abilities. But the Air Force has also been much slower than it predicted or planned to be in integrating the F-35. So has half of the fifth generation fighter force it planned to have at this point. So it's getting smaller. We need more planes. We need better planes. And then finally, we need the planes that we do have to be more ready. The mission capable rates continue to be too low for some really essential assets. For instance, the F-22, our premier air superiority asset, aside from the F-35, we only have 186 of them, so they're precious resources. And really, only half the fleet is ready to fight. The thing I hear all the time about this is that there's a paint coating on the plane that's really hard to maintain that keeps it difficult to keep ready to fight. So basically, we don't have planes ready, we don't have enough planes, and we don't have enough capable planes. And then finally, Kyle, one other area that I think deserves a lot more attention is our munition stocks. We're simply just not buying the missiles and bombs that we need for a long war against a peer competitor. Seth Jones wrote for us this week, kind of laying out in the wargaming that he'd done at his think tank CSIS. The US ran out of its best long-range anti-ship missiles and its air-to-surface missiles. These are known as LRASM and JASM in the Pentagon. It ran out of these missiles in about a week of a war. So that is simply not sized properly for the kind of war we might be fighting. And these missiles are exquisite, so they can take 24 to 36 months to produce, meaning that the time to buy them is now. So basically, I think that is one area where we really need to make a change and start buying these missile parts now, maybe buy some surplus capacity so we could put them together later, and start getting some creative thinking to how to get the Air Force's stocks much more prepared for a larger conflict against a more powerful adversary. Secondly, we looked today in today's editorial at the Navy, and the Navy wants to grow to 355 ships, has been talking about this for more than a decade, but is just completely stagnant at less than 300 ships. And the reasons for that are many, but basically the Navy's been under-delivering on its shipbuilding for years. By one analysis, under-delivering by 10 ships a year over the past 5 years. So we have just been unable to build ships. The Navy wants to retire more ships to save money. In the 23 budget, they tried to retire 24 ships. Congress stopped some of that. So the Navy is really just not able to grow, even though it would like to. It's been stuck in the mud by these institutional and political pressures. So that is also a kind of important facet. But I think the common argument you hear is, well, again, same with the Air Force. Our ships are more capable, but China is really closing the technological edge on every type of technology. Long-range fires, aircraft carriers, they are really working on narrowing that gap. So I know this is a long, dispiriting report, but I think what we've learned is that we've gotten into sort of a complacent posture, which is not unusual for a peacetime power. And we need to make some changes in footing based on what we know, and need to add more ships, more aircraft, more munitions, and take some creative steps to keep us from going too low in hard power over the next 5 years.